July 1st, 1916. Dawn broke over the Somme River in France, but this was no ordinary sunrise. It was a dawn that would be etched into the annals of history, a dawn that heralded one of the bloodiest battles ever fought. This dawn was choked with anticipation, heavy with dread. Soldiers, young and old, braced themselves for the unknown, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. This was the day the guns would open up on the German lines, the start of what would become known as the Battle of the Somme. The air would soon be filled with the deafening roar of artillery, a prelude to the chaos that was about to unfold. For months, the British and French had planned, amassed their forces, their artillery, their hopes. They had strategized every move, believing that this offensive would break the stalemate that had gripped the Western Front. Across the no-man's land, the Germans waited in their trenches, dug deep into the earth, ready to repel the inevitable assault. They had fortified their positions, prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. This was World War I, where hope often died a quick death, and the Somme was about to become a brutal testament to that truth. The landscape would soon be scarred by craters and littered with the remnants of shattered lives. The stakes were already impossibly high. Every soldier knew that the outcome of this battle could change the course of the war, and perhaps the course of history itself. France, much of it already under German occupation, yearned for relief. The French people, weary from years of conflict, looked to the Somme with a glimmer of hope. Britain, its armies bloodied at Gallipoli, needed a victory, a turning point in this new kind of war. The British soldiers, having faced the horrors of previous battles, were determined to make a stand. The Somme, it was believed, would be that turning point, the place where the tide turned, where German arrogance would finally be broken. The generals had placed their bets, and now it was time to see if their plans would bear fruit. But war, as any soldier could tell you, rarely follows the script. The Battle of the Somme would prove to be a grueling test of endurance, courage, and the human spirit. A battle that would leave an indelible mark on all who lived through it. On one side stood the German army, a veteran force hardened by years of combat. These soldiers had faced countless battles, their resolve and tactics sharpened by the relentless grind of war. They were masters of defense, their trenches layered, interconnected, fortified with machine guns that could cut down men by the dozens in seconds. Their positions were nearly impregnable, designed to withstand the fiercest assaults. Facing them, a coalition, the British Expeditionary Force, many of them volunteers, eager but inexperienced, young men who had answered the call to arms, driven by patriotism and a sense of duty, and the French army, battered but resolute, fighting for their very homeland. These soldiers had endured the brunt of the conflict, their spirits unbroken despite the heavy toll. The stage was set for a clash of empires, but it was a clash that would be fought not in grand maneuvers, but in the claustrophobic, mud-caked trenches that snaked across the landscape. The terrain itself became a formidable adversary, with every inch of ground fiercely contested. This wasn't the war of Napoleon, of sweeping cavalry charges and grand pronouncements. The romanticized visions of past conflicts had no place here. This was a war of attrition, of inches and hours, where survival often seemed like victory enough. Soldiers lived in constant fear, their lives hanging by a thread, as they navigated the treacherous maze of trenches, always alert for the next attack. Imagine, if you will, the trenches, not just ditches dug in the earth, but elaborate, interconnected networks of tunnels, dugouts, and fortified positions. Imagine the constant fear of snipers, the ever-present mud that sucked at your boots, the stench of death that permeated everything. This was the reality for the soldiers at the Somme, a reality where the enemy was often invisible, but his presence was always felt. The trenches were a breeding ground for disease, for despair, for a kind of dehumanizing horror that the world had never seen before. And yet, amidst the mud and the blood and the fear, there were also acts of courage, of compassion, of men clinging to their humanity in the face of unimaginable barbarity. The battle began with an artillery bombardment of unprecedented scale, a thunderous prelude to one of the most infamous battles of World War I. For 7 relentless days and nights, British guns pounded the German lines, hoping to obliterate the enemy and pave the way for an easy victory. The sheer intensity of the bombardment was meant to break the German spirit and defenses. But the Germans were too well dug in, their defenses too strong, and their resolve unshaken. They had constructed deep bunkers and fortified positions that withstood the onslaught. When the bombardment finally lifted and the British infantry went over the top, they were met with a storm of machine gun fire and artillery. The German defenses, largely intact, unleashed a deadly counterattack. The first day of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, would go down in history as the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. The scale of the tragedy was unimaginable. Over 57,000 casualties, nearly 20,000 of them dead. The fields were littered with the fallen, a grim testament to the horrors of war. And yet the battle raged on, week after week, month after month, a grinding, attritional struggle with no end in sight. The Somme became a symbol of the futility and devastation of trench warfare, a relentless and bloody stalemate.